Ann Case earned her undergraduate degree from SUNY Albany in 1980 and then completed her doctoral degree in economics at Princeton in 1988. From there, she spent 3 years in the economics department at Harvard before returning to Princeton in 1991 and never leaving again. She has retired from active teaching and is now an emeritus professor in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. Angus Deaton was born in Scotland in 1945 and took all of his college degrees at Cambridge in England, finishing his PhD in 1974. He then spent nearly a decade teaching economics at the University of Bristol before moving to the United States and joining the faculty at Princeton in 1983. He is the Eisenhower Professor of International Affairs in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. This article is important because in the second decade of the 21st century, Case and Deaton appear to have rediscovered the same pattern of rising death rates in middle age observed 30 years earlier in Hungary. But this time the rising death rates have appeared among middle-aged white Americans. It remains to be seen whether this rising tide of mortality will also last for 30 or 40 years, or whether it will turn out to be a temporary aberration. Either way, however, their work serves as one more warning sign that we probably should not just assume that low death rates are here to stay. Case and Angus Deaton started publicizing their research on recent trends in U.S. death rates a few years ago. It caused a sensation. As we already know, the normal thing for death rates is to decline to lower and lower levels all the time, or at least to stabilize and cruise along at a steady rate once they reach really low levels. That's just what death rates are supposed to do. For example, in the first chart that they present in their 2015 article, they show such falling death rates throughout the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century for several different Western countries. When somebody reports something else about death rates, everyone sits up and takes notice. And this is just what Case and Deaton did. According to their figures compiled from official United States death rates, the death rate among non-Hispanic white Americans between ages 45 and 54 stopped declining shortly before the end of the 1990s. For all the years of the new century so far, death rates for this group have actually been increasing steadily, a trend that has been going on for nearly 20 years now. These results have provoked a firestorm of commentary in both the popular and scientific press, and even have acquired a catchy shorthand label. The media pundits now refer to this excess mortality as deaths of despair. How many deaths of despair are we talking about? Case and Deaton estimate that if you just draw a straight horizontal line forward from the 1998 inflection point in the chart, the area between that and the actual rising death rate would represent about 96,000 deaths that would not have happened if the rate had not been going up. If you get a little more extreme, you could continue the death rate for the U.S. downward in the chart so that it is roughly parallel to all the other countries shown, and then estimate the number of deaths between that continued mortality decline and the actual increase. They estimate that this represents nearly 500,000 extra deaths due to the change in the mortality trend. That makes the change in the mortality trend a pretty important one. Interestingly, even in this first picture of the phenomenon, they give us a little hint of what is to come in their explanation. They add another line to the picture, this time for the Hispanic population in the United States. For Hispanics, there is no sign of this upturn in death rates in middle age. U.S. Hispanics have followed pretty much right in the footsteps of the population of the UK, that is, Great Britain. The death rate curves for these two populations are almost impossible to tell apart in the chart. Case and Deaton again rounded up the usual demographic, social, and economic suspects and put them into the statistical lineup. Given the high-profile, hot-button status of race and ethnicity in pretty much every topic of conversation in American society, it is not too surprising to find that they started with this subject for a clue. And their first clue turns out to be quite important and dramatic. In addition to the declining death rate that Hispanic Americans continue to enjoy in recent years, we find out that the death rate for Black Americans continued to fall even faster throughout this whole period. In fact, the continuing decline in Black death rates and the rise of non-Hispanic white death rates meant that the two rates actually crossed paths during this period. Pretty stunning when you consider that the death rate for black infants is still more than twice as high as for white infants and showing no signs at all of any convergence. Whatever's going on here is only happening to non-Hispanic whites and not to either black or Hispanic Americans. Once they finished documenting this stark ethnic contrast in mortality trends, Case and Deaton looked around for the next suspect. The next one they picked up for questioning was formal schooling. Given the strong differences in death rates and other demographic patterns by education in American society, this is also a very logical choice. And again, they hit the jackpot. It turns out that although death rates for all white non-Hispanics were not falling along with those for other groups, the slight upward trend was not all that terrible. The really terrible upward trend appeared when they whittled down the non-Hispanic white population and looked only at people who had gone no further in school than finishing high school. It would be very interesting to see what they would find if they looked at high school dropouts separately from those with a completed 12th grade education, because usually those two groups that they lump together here are examined separately and usually show sharp differences. I wonder what they might be hiding by lumping these groups together. At any rate, among only these least educated non-Hispanic whites, death rates in America appear to have jumped by about 1/3 since the beginning of the century. This is indeed a very alarming and serious long-term trend. Their next choice for a suspect to interrogate was sex. Among non-Hispanic white Americans in the dangerous Middle Ages, death rates rose for both men and women at about the same alarming clip for the first 5 or 6 years after 2000. But then, as the trend kept right on climbing for women at pretty much a linear pace, the death rates for men peaked and started to drop back down again until today they're nearly back down to the level observed at the start of the decade. So whatever is going on here, it is going on worse for women than for men. What could be killing less educated, middle-aged, non-Hispanic white women? The cynics among us might suggest that it could be less educated, middle-aged, non-Hispanic white men. If they're not actually killing the women are mostly living with them anyway, and perhaps suffering lethal consequences of some kind in that environment. Of course, this is not really a plausible hypothesis, but the sex difference in mortality trends might help us to rule out some other possible speculations. For example, we might wonder whether these less educated men and women are despairing because they've lost their jobs and can't find work. The labor force is no longer a very friendly place for people who don't get beyond high school. There's not much for them to do out there. But this possible explanation won't work for the contrasting trends among men and women. The employment crisis for those with the least education in American society has been much more serious for men than for women. And yet the mortality increase has been more serious for women than for men. The real clincher in the analysis by Case and Deaton, though, as far as I'm concerned, comes when they question their fourth suspect, causes of death. Here they find what I see as a smoking gun. Death rates from lung cancer have been falling within this critical population, as shown in their figure in the article. So have death rates for heart disease and other civilized killers. Instead, the rising death rates in middle age can be attributed pretty much entirely to causes like cirrhosis of the liver, suicides, and what are classified broadly in U.S. death statistics as poisonings. These poisonings are not caused by somebody putting arsenic in your teacup straight out of some Agatha Christie story. The increase in poisoning deaths is caused by people abusing drugs, particularly powerful painkillers like OxyContin, Percocet, fentanyl, and other products that are making a lot of money for big pharmaceutical companies and for organized crime. At this point, the sense of deja vu comes rushing back to us with a vengeance. This is exactly the same pattern we observed in Hungary 30 years ago. A group of people in middle age, saddled with some kind of peculiar social and economic disadvantages, began to destroy themselves in just about every way they can think of. We might even call it a new kind of multiphasic response, this time increasing the death rate instead of lowering the birth rate by any means available. But in that old example, it was an experiment with communism gone horribly wrong that was at the bottom of the problem. And it was all men, And here we see lung cancer deaths falling for these Americans because they're not smoking as much as they used to. So it's not a perfect match. We still have a lot to figure out, even though the similarities certainly are striking. One covered by Case and Deaton, discussed in more detail close to the end of their article, actually was also visible in plain sight for even amateur demographic detectives from the start. A hint about it actually appears in the title of the article when they tell us that they are particularly concerned with mortality in midlife. This midlife period is exactly the same as the working ages where the problem cropped up in Hungary. A detailed chart of rising death rates for these non-Hispanic whites with below average education tells the story eloquently. These are poisoning deaths, or in other words, mostly drug overdoses and acute alcohol poisoning. Plus they also include cirrhosis of the liver, clearly leading to alcohol abuse, and then just for good measure they throw in any other kinds of suicide that don't take as long as these forms of self-destruction to do the job. All the age groups from 35 to 65, in other words for pretty much the entire span of active working life except the first decade or so when people are still busy finishing school and getting started on their lifetime trajectories of work and other activities, these self-destructive deaths were climbing at a roughly straight line linear pace ever since the beginning of the century. But the chart is as revealing for what it does not contain as for what we can see in it. Age groups where the death rates were not increasing do not appear here. There are no ages under 30 represented, and no older ages beyond the typical age of retirement. We could just as easily call these the working ages, just as in the case of Hungary. So what is wrong with the working ages? Death certificates don't have a box to mark for despair, so we have to try to isolate the problem some other way. Now we are sure that we're looking for an explanation that does not apply to children, or to old people, or to Black or Hispanic minority populations, or even non-Hispanic whites who've been to college. Well then, what else could they look at? By this point, they must have been getting a little frustrated with trying to find an explanation. The sixth clue they look at shifts to questions about geography. If they could pin down the increasing death rates to only one part of the country, that would help. Maybe it was happening only in the Rust Belt cities of the upper Midwest, like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, and so on, because those cities were in such trouble as industrial jobs all disappeared in a mad scramble by corporations to find cheaper labor and no unions. Or maybe it only happened in the South, the place we usually have been able to look for health problems in American society. So they counted up the death rates by regions and plotted them on a chart showing the poisoning drug abuse deaths on one axis and suicides on the other. They put dots on the chart for where each region stood year by year so that we can track the sequence of changes in each region. And the South doesn't look too great. They start out in 1999 with the highest suicide rate, farthest to the right, and the black dots climb up and up to the right over the years, indicating higher and higher death rates from both kinds of causes. But the trouble with this picture is that the West region, with states like California and Oregon and Washington and Hawaii, are mixed right into the same track on this chart as the South region. Both of them keep the highest suicide rates, and both of them wind up with the highest rates of drug poisoning deaths. About the only thing that these two regions have in common is that they are places where a lot of Americans were moving to over these years. If we look at all the counties in the country, we can make a map showing which of them gained or lost the most population over the first decade of the 21st century. The results are pretty easy to spot on such a map. The areas that lost population are mostly in the inner part of the country, away from the coasts, especially in the belt of states from Montana and North Dakota down to Texas that have been losing the most people and that are famous for giving the largest majorities to the Republican Party in all recent elections. The areas that have been gaining people are nearly all ringed around the coast in the Pacific Northwest, California, and from Florida right up the Atlantic coast into New England. This is not at all the same geographic pattern as where the rising death rates are concentrated. Some of the areas of despair have been losing population, but other areas have been gaining population quite nicely. People wouldn't have been all that eager to move there if there were obvious problems so serious that you would wind up wanting to destroy yourself. So that's another hypothesis that won't work. Even more frustration for Case and Deaton. While we're on the subject of geography, though, there might be another way to slice this pizza. Could it be that this is not really about different regions of the country, but about another kind of geographic contrast that occurs within all regions? The profile of the people prone to deaths of despair might seem to be pointing at rural areas in particular. Lower education? Check. Concentrations of non-Hispanic white population? Check. High unemployment? Check. Inconveniently, however, some recent research looking explicitly at only rural counties across the United States has shown that there has indeed been a rapid rise in drug-related poisoning deaths. This is particularly true for the northern end of the Appalachian region in southern Ohio, western Kentucky and Tennessee, and West Virginia. It is also true for rural New Mexico, rural Nevada, and the new cannabis heartland of America, northern California. But other rural counties, such as those in the Black Belt of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, or among the shrinking rural populations left behind in the Great Plains from the Dakotas through Oklahoma, have not experienced this same epidemic of drug deaths. In those regions, drug-related deaths have been falling instead. So obviously this is not some kind of general pattern in rural America. Even after all of these suspects, we still haven't managed to isolate the master key to understanding the deaths of despair. As the Roman poet Ovid once declared, "The cause is hidden, but the result is known." Early innings for the study of issues surrounding the deaths of despair phenomenon, since Case and Deaton just brought the problem to our attention a couple of years ago. Since that time, a lot of other people have tried their hands at figuring out what might be behind this unusual new case of long-term rising death rates. For example, the regional patterns that Case and Deaton documented with their chart full of dots prompted subsequent study of whether this kind of pattern is the same for men as for women. When we look at regional patterns just for women, it is interesting to note that there is no evidence of the increasing mortality trend for less educated non-Hispanic whites in the Northeast region, but a very strong increase in the South. Is it just a coincidence that these women tend to have been leaving New England and moving into the South? Has there been some kind of selection mechanism working here? Only time and future research will be able to sort out this question. On the other hand, when we look at the equivalent picture for men, we discover that the relative ordering of mortality patterns by region are similar, with the lowest death rates in the Northeast again and the highest in the South. But all of the trends and rates in all regions peak sometime between 2005 and 2010, and then show at least some signs of dropping lower again. This confirms the idea that the deaths of despair have continued to become a more and more serious issue for women over time than for men. Perhaps the most intriguing new development in the deaths of despair question appeared in a newer article published by Case and Deaton in 2017, a couple of years after their groundbreaking 2015 study. If we reorganize the deaths to follow the same groups of people over time, instead of looking at one particular year of data or another, we get a very different picture. This alternative approach is called a cohort perspective because it follows the same cohort of people over time. In this case, we're talking about a birth cohort, that is, people all born in the same year some time ago in the past. For example, people born in 1935 would have been 55 years old by 1990, when Case and Deaton first picked them up, gradually aging until they reached 75 years old by 2010. Case and Deaton graphed the death rates for non-Hispanic whites in that birth cohort along a line labeled 1935 for their birth year. Across these 20 years of their lives, death rates remained pretty flat between ages 55 and 75. Each younger birth cohort of people is shown by their own line in the figure. For example, white non-Hispanic Americans born in the 1960 cohort first appear when they were 30 years old and reach age 50 by 2010. The group shows an incredibly steep rise in death rates over the same 20-year period, as do all younger cohorts born in later years. In fact, the big jump in the steep upward slopes of these 20-year spells of mortality for different birth cohorts seems to come with cohorts born after 1945 or 1950. Case and Deaton linked this new upward trend in death rates for younger generations of Americans to economic uncertainty. For example, they point out that people in those earlier birth cohorts, where death rates did not jump up so much with age, mostly enjoyed what are known as defined benefit pension plans. That is, you pay into a pension plan out of your wages or salary, and the company or the government that you work for invests the money in a pension fund with an eye on the future. Later on, when you reach retirement age, your pension contract with the company guarantees that they will pay you a certain amount of money based on how many years you worked and your salary level. If the company made smart investments, the pension fund can easily cover these payments to you, and the company may even get to keep some of their profits. But if the investments don't do so well and the pension fund doesn't have enough money to pay what they promised you, the company has to cough up the extra money and pay you anyway. This gives people a nice, secure feeling about their futures. Over time, though, companies and now also government units have gradually done away with these defined benefit pension plans. Instead, they help you to invest some of your earnings in your own individual retirement account. These personal accounts are called defined contribution plans because the benefits you eventually may get from them in your old age depend entirely on how much you put in and also on how well those investments do. If you pay into such a defined contribution plan for your entire working life, and if the company helps out and pays in some kind of matching contribution, but then the investments that you bought suddenly go bankrupt, all of your invested savings will disappear, and the company will have no further obligation to you. This obviously can make people a little nervous. To make matters worse, less than half of all Americans even have any kind of retirement pension plan investments at all, whether defined benefit or defined contribution. This is particularly true for the younger generation, shown by Case and Deaton to have rising death rates. There are also other strange and unsettling trends that we can find in death rates during this same period, although it is not easy to find a simple connection between them and the deaths of despair among non-Hispanic whites with low education. For example, other research has discovered that at younger ages, young women who get pregnant and deliver a baby in the United States seem to have higher and higher risks of death from complications of pregnancy and childbirth every year. This maternal mortality rate has been rising during the same period that Case and Deaton noted that the deaths of despair were increasing among older people. The rising maternal mortality in the United States stands in sharp contrast to falling maternal mortality in other developed countries, just as we observed later in life for the deaths of despair. But this is not a result of self-destructive behavior, like suicide or cirrhosis of the liver. The most likely cause of worse maternal mortality over time in the United States would be deterioration of health care for pregnant women and babies. This, in turn, could be related to the furious debate over health insurance in the United States, where health care costs far more than in any other developed country, even though it is not delivering the same kind of survival results observed in other developed countries. If we plot life expectancy on the vertical axis of a chart, the higher up you go, the better you're doing. At the same time, if you plot healthcare expenditures out to the right on the horizontal axis, the further you get pushed out to the right, the worse you're doing in terms of efficiency. On this chart, the United States is a horrifyingly bad outlier. While our life expectancy gains lag badly behind other developed countries, flattening out the U.S. curve over time, our incredibly inefficient and expensive system of healthcare pushes us far out to the right of any other developed country in the world. When we look at things this way, and when we remember that healthcare in the United States really depends on how much you can pay for it, maybe the deaths of despair are just the tip of an iceberg, a symptom of a much more extensive problem. We can also add a few more odd little hints to the emerging picture. For example, other research has noticed that the rise in these deaths of despair since the start of the new century has been much faster for people who are never married or divorced than for people who are married or who lost a marriage through widowhood. This could perhaps be a selection effect, with the most despairing people having more trouble getting married or staying married. Or it could mean that the marriage itself might act as a protective buffer to some extent. This same pattern by marital status appears in mortality rates for most ages in most societies, even when death rates are not changing much over time, and is the subject of a whole separate research literature in itself. Finally, we can trace some of the components of the deaths of despair much further back in time than just the last couple of decades. For example, the alcohol problem that produces all those deaths from cirrhosis of the liver has been growing steadily in American society for at least the last half century, and probably for even longer than that. It is important to recognize that Americans are drinking more and more alcohol every year, and that the death rate from alcohol abuse-related deaths has been rising in parallel with this rising consumption trend for a long time now. The deaths of despair research has given rise to a lot of attention just now to abuse of opioid painkiller medications like fentanyl and OxyContin. But even if there were no such drugs for such people to abuse, or if they were all locked away by the drug police, if we had such a thing, people would still be finding other ways to destroy themselves. They would still be dying of cirrhosis of the liver. They would still be crashing their cars into trees on purpose. They would still be shooting themselves in the head with handguns. The despair that Case and Deaton talk about is not caused by the tools people use to destroy themselves. So if we want to understand and prevent these rising death rates, we need to find out the real causes and work on those.